Cold has broken more armies than swords ever did, and the Vikings knew that centuries before modern warfare caught on. That's the uncomfortable truth hiding beneath the iron and blood of Viking history. While rival kingdoms focused on weapons, armor, and numbers, the Vikings quietly mastered something far more decisive: heat. Not comfort, not luxury. Survival heat. The kind that keeps fighters alive, mobile, and deadly in conditions that should have wiped them out. And after these warriors clashed with organized armies across Europe, those armies didn't just copy Viking tactics. In some cases, they actively tried to bury them. Here's where it gets interesting. Viking heating wasn't a single invention or a clever trick. It was a system, a mindset, a ruthless understanding of energy, insulation, airflow, and human endurance. And when centralized powers finally realized how effective these methods were, they saw a problem. Knowledge like this makes people independent, hard to control, hard to starve, hard to freeze out. The Viking longhouse was the foundation of everything. From the outside, it looked simple: wood, turf, stone, nothing impressive. But inside, it functioned like a carefully tuned thermal engine. The hearth was placed low and central, not pushed against a wall. Heat rose slowly, pooled under thick turf roofs, and radiated back down. Smoke didn't rush out. It lingered just long enough to warm beams, walls, and sleeping platforms before escaping through roof vents. This wasn't accidental. Archaeology shows consistent design choices across regions, suggesting shared knowledge passed down deliberately. The walls mattered just as much as the fire. Vikings packed earth, turf, and animal matter into layered insulation that trapped warmth while blocking wind. Turf roofs weren't just for weatherproofing. They absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, flattening temperature swings. That meant less firewood burned, fewer sparks given away, and steadier warmth during long winters. For a raiding culture constantly on the move, efficiency wasn't optional. It was survival. Now here's the clever part most people miss. Viking heating wasn't confined to homes. Camps used shallow fire pits covered with stones and earth to create ground heat. Warriors slept over warm soil, not open flames. That reduced smoke, cut visibility, and kept bodies functional before dawn raids. In military terms, this was honestly a game changer. An army that wakes up warm moves faster, thinks clearer, fights harder. When medieval armies later faced Viking-descended forces or communities using similar methods, they noticed something pretty unsettling. These people didn't need massive supply lines. They didn't rely on constant fuel deliveries. They used local materials, physics, and discipline. Centralized armies, especially feudal and early state-controlled forces, depended on logistics and control. Heating systems that anyone could build, well, they really undermined that control. As Europe moved towards stronger monarchies and standing armies, unofficial survival knowledge became, well, inconvenient. Manuals favored standardized barracks, open fires, and later, centralized heating in controlled spaces. Peasant-level thermal independence just wasn't encouraged. In some regions, building styles shifted intentionally. Open hearths replaced sunken ones, and thinner walls saved materials but, lost heat. These weren't always technological upgrades. Sometimes they were political choices. There's also the issue of smoke. Vikings understood smoke management long before chimneys became widespread. They used low-oxygen fires that produced steady heat with minimal visible output. That made winter camps harder to detect. For armies relying on surveillance and control, invisible warmth was, honestly, a threat. It allowed resistance groups and remote communities to endure winters without exposing themselves. Knowledge like that doesn't vanish by accident. One of the most powerful Viking heating tricks was body-centered design. Sleeping platforms were raised, insulated, and often shared. Heat from one person warmed the next. Furs and wool trapped air, not just warmth. Vikings layered intelligently, using materials that stayed insulating even when damp. Later armies pushed rigid uniforms, standardized bedding, and individual spacing. It looked organized. It was easier to regulate, but it was thermally inferior. Cold soldiers burn calories faster. They fatigue quicker. Vikings avoided that trap. They treated heat as a resource to be conserved, shared, and recycled. Even ship design played a role. Viking longships weren't just fast, they were dry. Elevated decks, smart drainage, and removable shelters allowed crews to stay warmer at sea. A warmer crew means fewer injuries, faster reaction times, and better morale. When rival navies finally caught on, they copied the ships, but not always the living practices aboard them. Over time, much of this knowledge faded into folklore or was dismissed as primitive. Stone castles replaced turf halls. Open fires replaced sunken hearths. But castles were cold, brutally cold. Historical records are full of complaints from nobles freezing inside their own fortresses. Meanwhile, rural populations quietly kept older methods alive, passed down through building traditions rather than books. Here's the real takeaway. Viking heating wasn't about comfort. It was about resilience. It allowed small groups to survive where larger forces failed. It reduced reliance on supply chains. It turned environment into an ally instead of an enemy. That's why it mattered. And that's why powerful institutions had reasons to discourage it. For modern survivalists, this isn't just history. The principles still apply. Insulation beats fuel. Ground heat matters. Smoke discipline saves lives. Shared warmth multiplies efficiency. Vikings didn't have modern science, but they understood thermodynamics through brutal trial and error. And, they optimized it ruthlessly. When you strip away the myths, the helmets, and the swords, you're left with something far more impressive. A culture that mastered the invisible forces that decide who lives through winter and who doesn't. No wonder later armies preferred to forget that lesson. If you're fascinated by the kind of knowledge that kept people alive long before modern technology, and sometimes in spite of it, you're exactly where you should be. Like the video if this opened your eyes. Share it with someone who thinks survival is all about gear. Subscribe to Legacy of Survival for more forgotten skills that history tried to bury. And stick around, because the past still has a lot to teach those willing to listen.